Hi guys, welcome to a new video of the Painting Academy. This time we're going to focus on techniques and procedures. We're going to speak about a very tricky subject that during many years some mafia of the miniature world that came from somewhere has insisted in that this is the only technique that we can use, which is the glazing. It's a technique that, despite of the fact that some people try to convince us that this is the only way to do it, this is a common thought by people that only knows how to apply colors with glazing, by glazing basically. So what is a glazing? A glazing is the application of the color by a very diluted version of it. So it's equivalent to take a very white t-shirt and introduce it in a dirty water. Obviously, when you remove it from the water, the t-shirt will be tinted or colored by the dirty water. The difference between glazing and a wash is the amount of liquid, basically. A wash is something uncontrolled, and a glaze is something controlled. So this technique is based on dilution and transparency, but also in the tracing of the brushstroke. So the glazing should be controlled, right? That's why I'm going to explain you the different parts of the glazing and how to trace with it and how to control it and all the different aspects related with this technique, which is nothing else than one of the many techniques that we have as painters, right? But only one of them. It's not the best one, it's not the worst one, it's just one way to use it. Glazing is based on the concept of watercolor, which means use fixed layers of colors and affect them by glazing, gaining saturation or luminosity or clarity or darkness, or normally it's done from light to shadow, from clear to dark, right? Or from desaturated to saturated, because we will gain something by insisting with very thin layers of diluted color. You can also use glazes with oil, right? So glazes it doesn't belong only to watercolor. It's based on the concept of watercolor, of the process of the watercolor painting system, but glazes is applied in acrylic and oils as well. So why I will use glazes? Because glazes give me the absolute control, because you are only tinting the fixed surface that is underneath. So you can start with a base coat, capa base, and on top of this you can build up layers very controlled. So this is the advantage. But what is the problem? The problem is that it's a super slow process. It's a technique that requires a long time, because you have to insist all the time. And no matter how good you have masterized the glazing, you're going to spend much more time than if you're covering the surface with a capa base, with a base coat, which is this. Capa base means base coat. Okay? Nothing else than this. So why we will use glazing? There are people that use glazing for almost everything. And this doesn't mean that they're going to acquire a more refined result, because you can also you can get a very refined effect with other dilutions or other techniques, not only with glazes, right? Or with other different tracing method with the brushstroke, right? So the problem is basically the time. It takes a long time. Second, it has another problem, which is that you will never get the maximum saturation and the maximum color or vibrancy of a color, because the color will be always much more strong if it's concentrated in his full pigment than if you are diluting it. This is an example that I can give you. Like, it's not the same if you take a wine, for example, like a whiskey by itself from the bottle, is not the same than if you put ice cubes on it. Or if you want to eat chocolate, you can eat a chunk of chocolate bar, right? And this tastes like pure chocolate, like 90% pure cacao. Or if you have a chocolate milkshake. Well, both things are tasty, but there's nothing to do between one and the other. One tastes like chocolate and the other one is chocolate. It's a different thing, right? So cooking, ingredients is something related with painting, you know. So we are almost like like chefs as well, right? The chef uses his ingredients to create different flavors, and he needs to know his elements, his ingredients to play with them. And we also, as a painters, we do the same, right? So our elements, the pigments, the colors, they have different stages, right? They have the basic stage. It's like water. You have the solid, the smoke, vapor, or the ice. You know, so solid like ice, vapor, or smoke, steam, sorry. And then you have the liquid, right? So liquid, solid, and steam, right? So with painting, it's almost the same. The colors has their main essence, their main essence is the color that comes in the pot, you know. Then we can dilute it, and we can get a diluted version of this color, who will be less strong, obviously. And then you have like pure glazing, which will be much more diluted and much more transparent, and obviously we are going to lose a lot of strength. So all these elements, as I said, they have different stages, right? They have their pure essence, and they have a diluted version of this purity. In the moment that we are adding water, what we are doing is being aggressive against the pigment. We are removing the essence of this color, and at the same time we are modifying it, right? But also getting more control over it, right? So obviously, the more you dilute, you will have more subtlety, you have more precision over your brush strokes, subtlety, sorry. So sometimes when, for example, I have a very advanced work that everything is placed and it has a lot of microtones, and the only thing that happens is that some parts needs a little bit more smooth. They need more like a render effect, more render finishing. Or, for example, when I have something already painted, but I want to tint it slightly to another color or another temperature or more saturated maybe. So, you know, subtle changes, this is an advantage to use it with glazes. And, well, sometimes glazes represent really well what we want to represent. Like, for example, if you paint the flesh of a female, you know, like a female who has been makeup, normally they represent, because we have this fucking stereotype that a woman don't have wrinkles or dots or whatever, which is obviously fake. But, well, this is what we understand as the beauty, unfortunately, for my taste. Obviously, glazes is a technique that matches really well with this kind of process, because it has a very specific goal of being subtle, being more flat, being more rendered, being more subtle, right? But obviously, if you are representing something completely the opposite, like an orc covered in blood, then the glazing method, it doesn't match really well, right? In this sense, glazes could be very useful for certain approachings, but not for everything, right? Like, imagine that you're painting a chiaroscuro, like a super big contrast from like Caravaggio style, this high contrast between light and shadow. Obviously, in these edges between light and shadow is a very tight, very narrow area where you can use glazes to make this small transition, right? Because it's a very short transition that from far away, you will not see this transition. You will see a very rough contrast. But when you get closer, there is a proper transition, right? So there you can use also the glazing. There are some elements that they deserve this subtlety, because the subtlety will represent this material, like, I don't know, like a plastic or the face of a female. But, excuse me, but if you're painting, as I said, if I see in a contest as a jury and I see an orc that is completely rendered, super clean, super smooth, and is representing a savage orc that has killed his enemies and covered in blood, well, maybe it will be very good from the technical perspective, but for me as a painter, it's a disaster. I don't imagine an orc making up his face, covering all his imperfection of the flesh, that to avoid that his enemies don't see his scars or dots or tonal variations. So let's be a little bit, analyze the work you're going to do, analyze the goal you have. If you paint everything just with glazes, everything will look the same. I can show you many examples. That is not that I don't respect this kind of works. I respect any kind of painters, but this happens a lot of times in historical painting, that they are so obsessed. They are so obsessed with perfection, thinking that this is realistic, while realism has nothing to do with perfect transition. Indeed, check your face at the mirror and you will see. So if it's a matter of something that you want to do because it's an stylistic question, it's a matter of your taste, the style that you want to represent, that's perfectly fine. But don't tell me that this has been painted perfectly refined, all with glazes, during 3 years of your life because this is more realistic, because that's not true. I see so many pieces that are representing a battlefield and everything has been painted accurately with the most precise glazes over 3 months of the life of the painter. And sincerely, that makes no sense, because this is what keep us away from being artists. This is what keeps us attached to the artisany, to the craft, because most of the times we have not interpreted what we are doing. Maybe you might think that I'm just an asshole saying this, but what I'm telling you has a lot of sense if you think twice. Like glazing matches well with certain processes, not with everything, unless you are doing a specific style that is well represented by the glazing. Like, for example, you are doing a cartoony style where all the transitions should be superbly refined, Like if you're doing a cartoon from, I don't know, maybe one of those old pictures by Disney, for example, then this technique can be used, makes sense. Have I used glazes in my career? Yes, constantly. Do I use it only as a unique technique for all my processes? No, obviously. Have I used it as my main technique? Yes, in the past I did. And indeed, there are many examples of my work, especially from the Golden Demon era, let's say 2006, 2007. I have posted recently in my Instagram account some works where you can see the application of this glazing procedure, right? But what is the thing about that? The thing is that with the years, even if the results of this period where I was painting mainly with glazes the results were really nice, but then with the time you realize that you need some other things. Like, for example, when I started working in night models and I was aiming for much more saturation to represent a more like cover comic style, right? I saw that the artists, the painters that paint these covers, they use a lot of like hyper vibrant saturated colors, and I couldn't reach this saturation just by glazing. So I had to renew my perspective of painting and develop some other techniques and develop some other ways to apply the colors. So imagine that you want to make a transition between black and red, right? And between pure black and pure saturated red, like a primary red. This transition will require so many glazes to arrive to a point where you can see the transition between black and red, and even though the red will never be fully saturated. So you cannot use glazes for this, but you could patch the colors from pure black to pure red, and then use glazes for blending the intermediate separation, the intermediate borders, between the different tones of the colors. The thing is that if you want to make this transition just by glazes, you can use a base coat, capa base, and then you can make this transition very slowly with glazes, but it will take you years, and the result will never be as strong as using a less diluted color version. Another disadvantage, what I have said, you will never reach the pure saturation because the essence of a color, the primitive stage of a color is how it comes in the pot. So in the same moment that we add any diluent, we are attacking the color. We are attacking the main properties of this color. That's a fact. Another advantage is that we never concentrate the pigment. And why I will need to concentrate the pigment? Because sometimes pigment concentrations will create specific effects. Like, for example, someone punched me in the face and I want to make a part of the flesh that looks very reddish, that affected by blood. Can I use glazes for this? Yes, I can use it to make the transition between normal skin to red skin or reddish skin, right? But the point where all the brushstrokes of the glaze concentrate, it will never be red. It will be something reddish, which is the difference. Another disadvantage, which could be just a factor. It could be a disadvantage if you don't know how to solve it, but you can turn into your advantage, which is patching. What is patching? Patching is the last part of the body of a glaze. Is where the pigment stay concentrated. There is a lot of people that paints exactly like this. This is their main technique. Like Marmas Clans, for example, is one of these kind of masters of glazes that use the patch in his favor. He has a control over the glaze that is amazing. But for many people, this last part of the glaze where the pigment stay concentrated, it's a pain in the ass. How would you avoid this? By varying the direction of the glaze and leave the brush stroke and lift the brush stroke in the point where that color pigmentation, color concentration doesn't bother you, right? For example, if you make the transition between white and black and you do a white glaze and then you lift the brush in the dark area, obviously this will be visible. If you do it in the other way around, where you lift the brush, if it's white, it won't be visible, right? So the order and the direction of the glazes are important. Where you lift the patch, where you lift the brush stroke, is where the pigment will stay concentrated. You can also avoid this. You will see in the future in this video. So it's not a failure. It's just a fact that happens with the medium glazes, right? Not with the more diluted. So another fact that happens, another disadvantage, is that the glazing always generate a gray filter. Always. What do we want to say with this? That because there is never pure color, the effect is always desaturated. And sometimes it happens that when you see a beautifully painted figure in the screen and then you check it in your hand, there is a difference that is disappointing, right? So most of the times it's because the actual screens we use, they oversaturate the colors to make them look more interesting for the eye. So many painters are taking advantage of this to show amazing paintings that, don't get me wrong, they are amazingly well painted, but they are not as beautifully colored. The colors, they don't look so rich when you see these figures in hand. And it's because of the kind of pigment they use, and also because their main technique is the veladura, the glazing, which is never vibrant enough. So that's why sometimes we feel like something foggy, like filtered by a gray feeling. And especially when you use it with pigments that are low pigmentation or low saturation, like Vallejo, Reaper, Scale 75, all these colors, because, we're using a pigment that has been already affected by a diluent. Then if you over dilute it with a glazing technique, obviously the result will never be powerful enough, right? It's interesting how the companies, the brands that produce colors, they treat us like dumps. They treat us like people who don't know about pigments. And that's one of the main reasons why I'm explaining you all these things about pigments, because if you think that your super strong red from Vallejo is a pure pigment, mate, you are completely wrong. This pigment is already a very corrupted pigment because it's part of the idiosyncrasy of this brand, to bring you already desaturated or already diluted colors or already not vibrant colors that you can tame, that you can control better because, they don't trust on your technical skills. But obviously, if you became a better painter and you control more procedures, more techniques, more different dilutions and thickness of the body of the color, then you will be able to be more savage with the color. That's also something that happens. Normally, these pigments we are talking about, they are pastel colors that they have a certain amount of gray, black, or white, or they are called by me fake tertiary colors, which are colors that looks primary or complementary colors, like for example red or yellow or green, but that they are not, they don't look, you can perceive that they don't look like a pure green. They look like a condensed green, it's saturated by itself, but it's not pure, it looks a little bit corrupted. So if you work with these kind of colors, or even more, tertiary colors, that, like for example, a military green, and if you apply this color through glazing techniques, obviously the result will be a desaturated effect filtered, right? So that's why if you have this combination of kind of pigment and kind of technique, the most normal thing that happens is that your final result will be very grayish and that it will look flat. It will be a poor experience, poor visual experience in terms of tonal variation. Also, another disadvantage is that the glazing gives you similar levels of value. So each color has a value level, which means a level of gray, and is the level of clarity. I will explain this in a future video, right? But so what it does, the glazing, is to equalize all the levels of value. So if you work everything with glazing, all the colors lose a little bit of depth and lose a little bit of strength in the clarity. So both extremes are constrained, You will make all the colors perceived like grays. A good example is a pure color like black from Vallejo, If you apply this color with glazes, no matter how many layers of glazes you get, the result will be always like a super dark black, but never a pure black. So that's the reason why the use of inks, many times it solves this kind of problems. However, pay attention, because you can also make glazes with inks and then you overcome the problem of the lack of strength, right? And then we have another lie here in the miniature world, which is like, some people told us at some point that everything should look flat. And who was the mastermind who told you this? Have you ever asked Velázquez or Rembrandt or Caravaggio or John Singer Sargent, any great artists most of them are dead, unfortunately. Ask them if everything is flat, because the most sparkling point of a canvas will never be a flat color, never. Because it's like, if you see a non-metallic in a canvas, the brightest spot of light will be always a thick spot of titanium white, for instance, or even a less clear color, a darker color. But it will be a thick and dense, heavy body brushstroke, because light doesn't bounce the same over a flat surface than over a bumpy surface. And this is something that you have to take into consideration, right? Because for the moment, maybe your painting it doesn't have a level of complexity where you can also add the quality of the thickness of the paint. But, well, who knows, maybe in the future, the more complex your painting became, the more factors you can introduce. So sometimes a regular work benefit our goals. Like, imagine that you're painting like a plastic robot, something completely unorganic that is made of the same material in a factory, right? So then, well, it's a polished material, it's a soft material. So then it makes sense that you work mainly, not everything, mainly with glazes. But if you want to represent let's say a stone, like a rock, so this granite stone will never be flat, will never be a consecution of different layers of glazes. That makes no sense, because it has depth, it has spots of different colors, different crystals, different materials. So to represent this, you cannot use glaze. So it's important to recognize which elements can be related with which techniques. It's like trying to do the texture of the jean pants, with stippling. It makes no sense, because stippling can be related with skin tone or with wool or with like the backside of leather, things like this. But jeans is a very recognizable crossing thread. So you have to adapt the technique you need to the goal you are searching for, basically. So if you want to represent a stone of granite that is it has a very rich texture, it's full of different minerals, it's full of different bumpy elements, and yeah, from far you can say this stone looks gray, but this is a simplification, obviously. Yeah, it's gray, but then when you take it closer, it has many different tones, and these tones, from an aerial perspective, they cannot be understood or translated to painting just by glazing, because it makes no sense, you know? It has different levels of volumes, different levels of layers of different crystals. So with a glazing, makes nonsense. It's a pity that some things will not be able to be seen in the screen. That's why it's always better to look it in person. This is something that I do very often in my color theory classes, but they will try to explain it deeply so you can understand all the different explanations, right? So in this case, we have this color, which is a very intense colors inside of this his own tonality. It has a really good coverage. The colors we have used are this one. The first one is a Chimera color, red oxide. It has a very strong pigment for being a very matte color, which is normally not something very normal. You know, like if it's very matte, normally the color it won't be very strong, but in this case, it's very strong. It has a great coverage, which is one of the advantages of these colors. And well, it's some kind of it's like a kind of tertiary red. It's like a roof tile red, right? Then we have this carmine red from Model Color from Vallejo. The next one, however, in the screen you cannot see the differences so well, but in real the change is huge. This is a heavy body color from Liquitex. It's a super intense color, Pirole red. The next one is a Reaper color, so a very thin pigment, very nice coverage, and it's very matte, but it's not very strong. Next one is one of my favorite of all time. Is a Ruby Red from Old Citadel range. I love that. It's super strong and super vibrant. However, it's pretty matte when it dries. It's a very alive pigment and very flat. It's a very surprising color. I love that. Then we are gonna use a Dauler-Rowney Orange Red. That depending on how is your screen, you will perceive it orange or red because it's something completely in between. This one is from Dauler-Rowney. It's a super thin and concentrated pigment, very liquid, very fluid, and very vibrant, super strong because it has a lot of concentration of pigments. It has a lot of number of pigments playing. It's a soldier in our battlefield that will be super strong, right? And in this case, we took also a crimson, which is a darker red with the same properties of the Dauler-Rowney. So first, what is the dilution for a glazing? Dilution is adding any liquid element in this case that will reduce the strength of the pigment and it will gain transparency. Proportions is something variable, right? If someone tells you this has to be 90% of water, this is just a way to say something, you know? It's something approximate, but nothing else, right? And it depends so much on what is the color that you have underneath, because if the color you have underneath is a clear color, a very diluted glaze will work, but if it's a dark color, you will need to thicken the paint a little bit to affect, right? So this color became less fixative, you know. We reduce the opacity as well. We reduce the strength of the pigment, and you'll see how it works. This is a pure glaze. This is the best example of a glaze. And you see, this is the patch. This is where the concentration of the pigment stays. And this is what we call patch. So this is more or less about, like, I don't know, 85% of dilution. I will place the original color. Imagine how many layers of glazes we have to apply to arrive to this color. Check. This is like a mid glaze. That is how I call it. A mid glaze will be a medium version of a pure glaze with less water, basically. I will leave it until it dries, and then we explain. This color extended because colors, they have different stages, as I said before, like water. It can be steam, it can be ice, it can be water, right? So the color is the same. It has the concentrated stage, with density. Is different and it reflects differently than if we extend it. Then we dilute it, it becomes different again. You see that the tone is changing. Then we change the dilution again. Now we enter in the glazing sphere, and then it starts to lose his strength and his vibrancy until a point where, I don't know if the camera, we can see it. It turns pinkish, right? So this transition came from a pure, thick, dense pigment till this kind of super high glaze version. And if you see, the patch is not there anymore. I have absorbed it, so it can be a trick for you to remove it. Because, we have been told all our life, you have to dilute the color, but no one told us why, how, and how to avoid the possible problems of this. That's the problem. When you see someone that is teaching you just by, look how easy is what I do, without explaining you the reasons, maybe he is a great painter, but maybe he's not a good teacher, right? This will be like 60%, 70%, 80%. This is like the gradient, more or less. So please be more open-minded, This is an explanation. Then you have to bring it into your own way of painting. Let's see how the different colors behave applied as glazes. But first, different glazes. This will be like a 60%. %, more or less, Until we arrive to a point where we are just tinting, we're using just dirty water. So I rephrase the numbers. So this will be like 70, 80, 90, 95, more or less. This will be a previous glaze that we can still consider a glaze because it's pretty transparent. We can see the line drawn with the pen. So all these moments of the dilution, let's say, are considered glazes. So yeah, we use glazes in many moments of the painting work. Then let's use the Vallejo color. You see how it results like this when it's concentrated? In the moment that I start to extend, you see it starts to die straight away. That means that the pigment has not strength and has not fluidity. I apply maximum density, I extend, and see how it starts breaking. This color has no fluidity. The viscosity, the body of it, doesn't allow me to extend it. It's a rough color. And also the pigment is not very, very strong. In the moment that I start adding water, the colors start getting loose. But do you see that there is a huge difference between the color we see in the top, which is it turns pinkish, and this one in the bottom turns pinkish as well, but it's a different kind of pink. The upper one is a warm pink. The lower one is a cold pink. So these colors, Vallejo, they are really good for short brush strokes with glazes. But because it breaks very, very quickly, it means it has no fluidity enough. You cannot trace long with the brush. It means that they are good for very short glazes, but not when you want to cover a big surface. Learning about pigments lead you to the improvement, guys. And this is something that you have to realize. This is the color of, it's a heavy body. I think you can see the density. The viscosity is how when you touch it. This is a feeling of touch. And the density is a physical appearance as well. You know, how much material we have. Then we extend and see how long it lasts. You know, it keeps strong just by extending the pigment because it has a lot of pigment concentrated. And then when we start adding water, the pigment starts to lose pretty fast in this case. The thing is that heavy body colors normally they are not very fluid. They are viscose, they are dense, they have thickness, but they don't have flow. Flow, it will have an ink. So this has more capacity as a color in the moment that he is in his main essence, being a heavy body. But guys, another lie. Now it's trendy to use heavy body colors because you have seen it in many Facebook accounts or Instagram accounts. But you have to know when to use it or not. Because if you buy thick body, heavy body colors, and then you use it with glazes, it makes no sense. So the best way to use any material is understanding the essence of this material. So if you're using a heavy body color, then you have to use it in his main essence. It doesn't mean that you cannot use this color in his diluted version, right? But makes no sense, you know, because for making glazes, there are some other pigments and some other colors that will work much better than a heavy body color, right? So because these colors are not prepared, they are not designed to be applied by glazing, you know? So this happens a lot with golden, you know? People now gets crazy about buying golden acrylics because they have seen it in some painter's account. But, you know, you have to know that titanium white, for example, from golden acrylic, as soon as you add water, the pigment breaks, you know, because in his main essence, it works really well. As soon as you start diluting it, the pigment disgregates, it separates, right? Reaper, from the very main base, it has no coverage almost. You see this kind of translucency. As soon as I move, you look that it's not regular. Then I extend it. And you see that it starts already to fade out. It turns into pink without, it's like a purpley pink without adding water. Now, as soon as I add water, I can reveal the essence of these colors in terms of the pigments that are underneath. And obviously, it's much colder than the colors that is on the top. You know, that we can see the glaze on the top, right? Did you see the difference? The color on the top looks almost like a skin tone, while this one is purely a very cold pink. But the good thing about this pigment is that it's very controllable. For short glazes, it's recommendable. Ruby Red by Citadel is a beautiful color. It has some transparency from the very beginning, but the color is really strong and it's very vibrant. Another thing that that happens when you dilute colors with water is that by interaction with the lower layer, you will reveal some properties. Like in this case, as soon as we add water, we see that the tendency is going cold, right? So it means that how this color has been cooked, how this color has been created in the laboratory, it has more presence of cold pigments than warm pigments, to simplify the. It's difficult to see with the camera, obviously it's easier in person. But with high dilutions, you can still perceive the color. So that means that this pigment keeps some strength. Indeed, the upper one, the heavy body color, is a much better pigment, but has not been designed for being diluted. While this one has been designed for being used in any way, you know. So the Citadel one, in this case, is a color that can behave well under many different techniques or methods. Let's see an ink. Double round ink, you see, it's very flat because it's liquid, right? It has some transparency, but it's super strong in terms of vibrancy. And as soon as I start extending it, no water, you know, I have not used water till now. I'm just like absorbing the excess of paint from the brush. And you see how it turns into orange, you know, yellowish orange is revealing the essence. And it's not only about the intensity, it's about how long the intensity of the color lasts. The good thing about the inks is that you can last the intensity for a long, long time because it has a lot of pigment and it's very thin and very concentrated. And you see how it turns into yellow? I'm not mixing with anything, I'm just adding water right now. You know, so red turns into orange and then turns into yellow. That means that the last yellow that is revealed is the strongest pigment inside of the mixture of this color. So see how long it lasts? A lot. And how strong it is, because we are using here, it's like a pure glaze, almost like 90% of water, and see how the pigment is still there. Why? Because inks, they have a very vibrant pigment, very strong pigment, but also very thin, which is very cohesive. And what means is that in a drop of ink, there are much more pigment than in a drop of Vallejo regular acrylic. This one will tend to probably to cold, not warm. I will extend, and suddenly, instantly, you see the cold feeling, you know, it's colder, this pink. I hope you understand these differences. We will speak also about temperature in many other videos. It's a pity that I cannot, this is not a proper color theory class that will last like 2 days. But well, I hope that you are grasping elements of my conversation, right? So you see how much it lasts, this color. As soon as I start adding water, it lasts a lot. Again, a very high concentration of pigments. And even if I'm using almost like a 90%, look how much water I have in the brush. I'm just absorbing a little bit of the drop in a paper towel. But see how long it lasts, because it's an ink. So it means that, yeah, if you want to keep the saturation and the colorful feeling, maybe the colors that you have in your desk are not the right ones, guys. Do you see the differences? I hope this is useful. How to apply the glaze? How do I apply the glaze? I will show you the method. That's why I show you the paper towel. I mix both of them because I want the density of this color, but the fluidity of the second color, right? And I get an intermediate tone. Then I take a little bit apart and I add water and more water. But you see, I don't know how much quantity of water I have there because the color tend to shrink. And it's a fake impression because when this color in the palette looks so reddish, then I place it on top of the paper, and it's not a strong tone, right? One thing is to see it in a drop, and another thing is to see the drop extended. So what should I do? I take the color, I remove the excess, and then I can apply it. The trace is more controlled. Because it's a very big brush, it's like a 6. It's like a 6 number. Obviously, it will take a lot of quantity, so the failure is more acceptable, you know. Over the paper, it will look like this, but because I want to control it, first, again, remove of excess, and then I flip it backwards over a white paper, you see? I'm rolling through my finger. You see the movement of my fingers? And then I make it pointy. And I get better tip of the brush. You see? It gets pointy. And now I can control the glaze. You see? Match perfectly. How do I apply the glaze? All the brush of the all the body of the brush, that will obviously leave a trace, a brush stroke. When this happens, you have to recognize this moment. You have to reload the brush. Again, I always have towel paper and white paper, always. And with the core, the main body of it, or with the tip of the body. So we have like a white glaze, a medium white glaze, and a shrinked version. I don't recommend you to apply it straight like this, because like this is very, the kind of tracing, the kind of brushstroke is very recognizable. And then when I work on top with any other direction, you will see the interaction between two layers. So sometimes you will see me applying like this, or even doing a cross-hatching, because one thing is the dilution, glaze, and another thing is the brush technique, cross-hatching, stippling, tracing, patching, whatever. Imagine that I want to create some kind of texture. I can also do it with the dilution of a glaze. So sometimes what matters is the trace, the brushstroke movement. Some other times what matters is the dilution. Some other we are combining both. So sometimes we can use a glaze with a dry brush, or not well distributed. It will leave very interesting noise that we can apply maybe somewhere, I don't know, to generate certain texture. This is completely up to you, obviously. You have to use your imagination to see where can you use a certain dilution or a certain brushstroke or even a certain failure that reminds you to something else. And this is how I have developed my painting skills, Sometimes by failing, I recognize, oh, that's wrong here, but this looks like whatever, like rusted oxide, whatever. So then I apply this failure. Next time I have to achieve this specific goal. So here you see when I apply another glaze, I can make it a little bit longer. If imagine that this is a consecution of different glazes, right? I start very soft, like this, and then I gain more saturation by insistence. You see, like this. So I'm concentrating the color in one side. See how long it will take me to arrive to the original color just by concentration of the patch. How many years I will need to achieve something like this. I hope you see the difference. And this is an ink that has some transparency. But how long it will take to get something like this? Years. That's the reason why some people, when they say, oh, I've been painting this for 3 months, like if it was something for clap. And to me, it's like, okay, so what? Okay, maybe your transition will be perfect, but you have spent 3 years doing, or 3 months doing something that any painter with resources, that this is my goal, that you became painters with different resources, that you will do the same in 15 minutes with any other technique. If you see glazing, that is also related in this case with the paper. Obviously, the paper is porous, but here glazes always leave some kind of porous feeling, some grainy feeling, right? So it will always give us a feeling of filtered work. We have been talking about different stages, like a pure glaze, a concentrate patch for the glaze, different types of dilution, different colors, how they behave by glazing, different techniques used by different artists, like Marmas Clans, that he used patches. And well, let's draw something fast and try to apply glazes over it, right? So for example, this is a glaze already, this orange, because it's very diluted, and it's orange, I promise you, but because I am applying it very diluted, it turns yellowish, through the interaction with the white that is underneath and because of the dilution. So that's also a key, a tip for you. You have to be able to see that you are perverting the idea of the original color. Now I want to add some blush feeling, some redness to the feeling. If you see, I am moving the paths of the glaze towards the point I want to accumulate this color. And then I use the previous orange and I make the transition, the bridge step, and I extend it to make a more, a bigger extension. So you have to measure always which is the color that you're using and where can you leave the patch that won't be bothering you, right? Imagine that we have this A color. And then we have this B color. And then C color. So this is a very natural and intuitive progression, color progression, right? Very simple, like cold red, neutral red, and orange red. We are gonna wait until it dries, and while we're waiting, we'll do something different in a grisaille, which is this. I already explained it before in the auger bus, for example. The grisaille, this value sketch through grayness, through different levels of gray. That could be related to a base coat, for example. You know, a base coat done with two cans, black and white, and in between you will find many grays. So the color progression will go from slightly dark to slightly clear, from less luminous to more luminous, from colder to warmer. But here in the grayscale, what we are doing is just a transition, progression of clarity, brightness, from dark to more clear. So imagine that we have this progression of grays. And imagine another scenario, okay? We are doing some texture, like Kirill, for example. And I prefer to do the texture just in grayscale, okay? No color value. First, because we are playing with transparency, if we have a black and white or different colors, a texture based on contrast, like for example, the texture of a jean pants or a military pant, but this guy has fall into a pond, into a puddle, and he stained his pants, right? If there is enough contrast between the different noise, any kind of contrast, right? The contrast will stay there. But look what happened when I apply the glaze. I introduce the tone inside of the texture, right? And I just tint the texture. I don't lose the texture. I just tint it. Unless I do so many glazes that at the end the texture can end up disappearing. Obviously, it's not the same to make a texture over a clear or white surface than a dark one. Glaze over grayscale. Let's take the Chimera color range, for example. First, I'm going to vary the tone slightly. You see where I go from the brush, I go from the top to the bottom, because in the bottom, if I leave the mark of the pigment, it's not a big deal. So it helps me to make the transition that affects the intermediate red, also the separation between the two reds, and it end up in the dark side. So let's do it, let it dry, do it, let it dry, brush stroke, let it dry, brush stroke, let it dry. Now, I take a very clear color, like an orange. I get closer to it. It's not the same, but well, it's not exactly the same color, but it's similar. And then I glaze again and see how my brushstroke stops there, where I leave the patch in the middle, because in the middle, the patch of this color will be easily accepted. And now I will take an intermediate tone that belongs to the intermediate section. I will dilute it with a little bit of orange, and I do the opposite to leave the patch in between two colors. So I'm generating a bridge tone. The more time you do it, the more layers you accumulate, the result will be more refined. Imagine that you're doing a progression of very desaturated colors like lilac, pink, and clear skin tone. You can gain saturation by adding glazes as well. So you can do it in a more desaturated version that maybe is more controllable for you, and then add more saturation and more richness to the color. You see how it behaves on top of a grisaille? If I want to make it working perfectly, I will have to do it with a very diluted version of the glaze, like 90%, but it will take ages. Because you see that the glaze doesn't affect almost the dark color. The dark color is rejecting the glaze. You have to take into account that obviously a glaze always will affect the clearer color much more than the darker color or the mid-tone. So then it's not a matter of just taking one color and glaze over the full surface instead of varying the tone of the glaze in order to match the color that is underneath, obviously. Let's do some texture very quickly. You see how easy it is to make textures? Imagine that I want to keep this texture, but my main collector here told me I'm obsessed with the special wolf of this area of my country that has a special red tonality because it's my totem. I don't know. So I wait until it dries, and then I start tinting it. I said red, not orange. Okay, reddish. Reddish, go. And then we made and then we make this. Where do I end the brushstroke? In the dark part, because it's where it will accept a patch without suffering. And then we can remove the water or the liquid from the brush and absorb the excess. And now you see that it's more reddish. If you want it more reddish, you have to insist. Either you do a less controllable glaze that is a little bit less transparent, or more layers of a more transparent glaze. But it has to dry, and this is very important that some people, because they are desperate, because they have been painting for 6 months a 28 millimeter Space Marine only with glazes. Thanks God I don't have to do this anymore in my life. And they became very depressed, and then they want to run. But you have to let it dry. Otherwise, you are just moving the patch of the glaze. We can eliminate, we can erase the excess. Okay, so different types of tracing or brushstrokes of the glaze. Linear. Concentrating the patch towards a specific point. Imagine that I want a spark in the middle of a Space Marine shoulder pad, for example. Or make this the blush of a drunken guy in the nose, for example. You can do it like this. I leave it dry, and then I do a second layer from a more outside point that will have a lower transition. Only the patch, that's another way to use a glaze. With the tip of the brush, I leave the patch, the concentration of pigment, and settling down this pigment that when it will evaporate, it will be settled down softly. Imagine that you are doing like freckles in an Irish woman face. So it's not like taking the color directly. It's something more subtle that then obviously it's easily affected by any other glaze on top. So it will be more easy to integrate if it's applied like this. While this one is more difficult because obviously the color is thicker. What do we have to take into account? Which color it's underneath, obviously. Because if I have, let's say, a green, which is the complementary color of red, obviously the resultant glaze, it will vary the tone of the green and it will turn into something dirty, more brownish. And you see how it's not the same on top of white than on top of green. And when the base underneath, it has certain texture, if you see this in a microscope, you will see like different valleys of color, right? It's like a topographic map, with some kind of relief, right? Where will the pigment stay? Obviously, in the little gaps of this relief. This is a patching where I can concentrate the color and the pigment has not been extended, has been concentrated. And there is another thing that you have to take into account, that before the glaze evaporates is showing you the future result if you insist. So imagine how many layers I have to apply to turn this green into some kind of dark red. What I'm achieving is like a corrupted military green, like a browny green, like a green brown. And how can I apply this to miniatures? Glazes can be used for highlighting, for shading, for gaining richness of the color, for changing slightly or tinting the previous color that is underneath. So for many purposes indeed, we just need to know or get used to differentiate when the glaze is helping us or when the glaze is disturbing us or is not the best application of the color. So let's go with this miniature that is in process that probably you have already seen in the Patreon, and if not, you will see it very soon. We have this part that has already a transition, but imagine that I want to gain more like reddish feeling because maybe he has a punch there or a cut or something like this. So let's take a very reddish color with certain dilution, and I will delimit a cut, a wound, an element, a central element where all the glazes will go to. And now with a pure glaze, I first try in a paper what is the consistency I want, the dilution I want, and then see how I start applying lateral brush strokes towards the central element. And then I dilute it more. And you will see how this will slowly tint the surface. Why it looks a little bit orangey? The reason is because underneath the previous layer, is a orangey flesh. So, and because of the kind of pigments we are using, this is what happens. So it's not that you can always know what will be the result, but with the experience you can mostly guess it, right? Drying is super important, guys. Drying between applications is super, super important. And then we just insist. Sorry for the failures of the frame. Sometimes I need to get closer. I will learn how to resolve this in the future. Very, very sorry for that. But you see how by insistence, now I take a tone that looks similar to the flesh tone. Doesn't have to be the same color, but check how I mix the colors. So then you can relate this with what you have learned already in other videos. And I do something similar. You see, it's not the same, but it's pretty similar. I mix it with the tone of the glaze. And then I start cleaning, refining, and see. Remember not to leave the final body of the trace of the brush stroke. That could be resolved afterwards, but it's better to avoid it. The tone I'm using, the mixer is an ink that turns to yellowish, as you saw before, and mix it with Reaper. And obviously, the ink is winning the battle. That's also why it turns orangey. But if I want more red, I have to change the tone, and I can insist towards the wound. You see how I change the direction of the brush several times, pushing the color to the surface. And this can happen. See, there's an error here, that the laterals of the glaze, if you go too fast, happens. You see that you can see like a circle, like delimitation of the patch. That can happen. That is very typical. That happens, but you can easily fix by adding more intermediate glazes. So again, another intermediate tone, and you insist. And you see how I always go in favor of the direction that I need, where I need to concentrate the patch. Instead of doing this for a few minutes, you do this for 3 months or hours. Imagine the result. I'll take this Superman. You see this bluish tone in the top. The general tonality of the face is, it goes a little bit yellowish. It goes a little bit ochreish, like wheat color. I'm gonna use a turquoise filter to turn it into cold and make the spark even brighter in comparison with the previous tone that is yellow. I'm going to the cold section of the colors, and that's why it will shine so much by this kind of contrast of temperature. So you see that looks very whitey, but it's not white, not at all. You see, it's pure turquoise. It's just a matter of combination of colors. In this case, the effect will be very noticeable, very visible. And you see, this is by adding with the tip of the brush. I'm using the glaze to concentrate the pigment very subtly. I can place it first and also then insist by glazing on top with another flesh tone to tint it and reduce it. Another way to use the glaze. Imagine with this piece that I'm going to do a texture, for example. All these are pieces that I have in progress, that some of them has been already booked by a collector, and some of them are just things that I paint, and sometimes I show this to my collectors and they decide if they want to book it. So if you see a figure in one video that you are interested, just send me a PM, because maybe it's still not booked, and maybe we can agree something for the future. However, I have a long queue right now, but if you are interested, just drop me a message. Let's do a texture pretty quickly. Sometimes it's easier to make the texture without thinking too much about the tone. So it's about doing a texture, gaining contrast. This texture is related with a rusted effect, with the wear effect, right? And I'm gonna tint it with a tertiary green that you see how I'm doing it. Something very clear. It's like some kind of clear camo green or something like this, or like an apple tertiary green. It's a corrupted color already, And you see how I can make this into glaze dilution. And then I just glaze on top, dry, glaze on top, dry. And I will be introducing the color inside of the texture very slowly. Obviously, the more we insist, the less you perceive the texture. It's already integrated inside of the color. So by time to time, it's interesting to know where to stop or to regain more texture, more depth again. Another way to use it, I have this sword, and I'm going to do a typical transition that you see on Instagram. That looks very nice. All these Space Marine painters, something like this. I have certain transition. So now with a very clear gray, I will concentrate the glaze where it interests me, towards the point I want to leave the patch. You see, I direct the patch to the point that is interesting, and you see how my tracing, my brush strokes are short, and I'm like hitting the patch to that point, and see how it looks in less, I don't know, in 2 minutes or less. Then with now it's more blended, more softer, and then with more glazes with a clearer color, I dry. Look, it has generated a failure there. It's like a strange rhythm. Well, I can insist. I cover this with this clearer color. Insisting. I dry. And now I return to gray to go down. And then I go with the brush stroke. You see, I go up and go down, leaving the paths in the conflict areas where it has not been well blended. And then again, I turn into white for creating another bridge color. Well, it's not perfect, but this is a transition. So if I go down, if I go to the dark area, obviously I darken my mixture. You will always generate certain division between different patches. So then you have to start smoothing, blending by small brush strokes of intermediate tones between A, B, or it's like 0.1, 0.2, and then 0.11, 0.12, 0.13, obviously, what happened that achieving this by glazing takes much more time than blending in humid. A wet blending is much more effective for this. But imagine that this is already perfect, okay? And then I want to tint it because I say, I want the reflection of the sky, for example, in the sword. I get sure that it's dry, and then see how I apply the glaze. It's blue first, and instantly it's tinted, and then blue plus white, a clearer blue, for the clearer area. And see how I gain saturation in this case. And I have a pretty interesting transition of blue. So conclusions. Glazing is just a way to use the painting. It's painting very diluted, based on transparency, based on the layer that we have underneath. It's based on control, and it's based on insistency. You can use it. Yes, obviously, it's one technique. It's another resource. Do I use it? Yes, obviously, many times. In every process, when I want to be especially precise, when I want to be subtle, when I want to make short, small tonal variations, I will explain the patching in a different video because it's a different technique. It's slightly different. It's more concrete. But the thing is, it's very useful, obviously. It's a very useful technique. But is glazing the only way to paint? No, it is not. Painting is a varied combination of resources. And if someone tells you that this is the way to paint, many people that tells you have to dilute. Maybe these people have been painting for 30 years and they reach to a really high level of painting only doing one way, but all these figures will look the same. If you go to any museum and you see real painters, you will see that there is density in the painting and that there are many different brushstrokes, many different dilutions, many different ways to apply the same ingredient. So light doesn't bounce the same onto a flat surface than a bouncing, than a bumpy surface, right? Is it useful? Yes. Do we need it for everything? No. Where should we use this technique? That's completely up to you guys. You have to decide. This is an academy, okay? And the concept of an academy is that me and David, we will teach you all the resources we know that are plenty. There are many through different processes and different explanations and different kind of videos. And I think that we are doing a big effort, and it's also something that is easy to see to teach you, right? So these techniques are resources for you to use, and then you have to decide where to use it by yourself, because it's your own experience which will lead you to arrive to good conclusions and good decisions. So if you have a personality that you can allow yourself to make a perfect execution, then go to perfection at the glazing. But if you are more expressive or more vibrant in your personality, or you are more aggressive in the way that you communicate, makes no sense. I mean, I'm like this. As you can see, I'm very passionate, I'm very direct. But you can see here that I have been using glazes in my old works when I was learning the technical aspect, right? Many years ago. These works you have seen, the Blood Pact and the Descanso, are from 2006 or 2005, right, or 7. But the thing is, with the time you learn more resources, and then you learn which of these resources match better with your personality and the kind of painting that you like. So obviously, if you want to become a better fighter, you need to learn more resources. The more resources you know, the more resources you can combine, and the better results you can get, because your works will look more interesting and more varied. If you are a cooker, if you are a chef, the more ingredients you know, the more easily you will combine them. So I think that these videos are interesting. I want you to write something down. Please take 2 minutes to tell me if you like this kind of content, because if we don't get any feedback, then we don't know where to go. And then these procedures or different processes, these procedures, these different techniques will be connected with the videos of specific processes of each figure. Because sometimes when you ask me, why do you use this kind of brushstroke or this kind of dilution? Also, you have to reflect by yourself. By watching these videos, you will get the theoretical and practical knowledge. And by watching the processes of my miniatures, you will connect this knowledge with what you're seeing. And you have to interact as well. You have to participate of this learning process. I know it's easy to stay in the sofa and don't, just watching something or watching someone that is telling you, hey, this is the easiest way to paint. If you follow these steps, you became a professional painter in 3 videos. That is fake, mate. I mean, use your intelligence to know that the real knowledge, depends also on your effort. There is nothing in the world that you can learn without your effort and without your own interpretation. You have to make the techniques yours, right? If we start also creating this community surrounding the academy, and don't get me wrong, the academy is going well, but if you start participating, I promise you guys that you will learn much more. If you start sharing, if you like something, you can also say in social media, hey guys, watch out this Patreon that is doing these kind of things, because this is very useful. If you don't think that, obviously don't do it. I'm not asking for advertising. I'm just asking for you to participate, to give us some feedback, and also to be active in the learning process, right? I'm not complaining. I just want to tell you this because this has been a very special video for me, because it's something that I wanted to do for many time, since many time ago. And well, okay guys, so if you have any doubts, comment box, and see you in the next video. Bye bye. Thank you.